We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Natalie Archibald. She is the VP of People and Employee Success at Clio. Natalie, how's your day going?
It's going really well so far. How about yours?
It's good. It's good. I am excited to chat with you. I have a bunch of questions, but let's start for the beginning for our listeners. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and include your pronouns, your role at Clio, and then a fun answer to like when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Ooh, such good questions. All right. Well, as you mentioned, my name is Natalie Archibald. My pronouns are she and her. I am the VP of Employee Success at Clio, which is a cloud-based legal technology company based in Vancouver, Canada. And in my role at Clio, I oversee departments such as learning and development, workplace experience, employee engagement, and social purpose. And love my job, love being in BC. I'm also a mom of two small kids. So I have Leo, who is 4, and Luna, who is 2. They're my why. They're the reason I love doing what I do, and a small part of what I hope to contribute to the world in order to do my part in creating a future where my kids and all others can thrive. So what did I want to do when I was younger? There's actually a video of myself at maybe 2 or 3 years old that my parents have saying that I wanted to be a pizza maker. So I'm I'm Italian and Portuguese. I'm a first generation child of immigrants, and food is like a big part of our culture, and it still is a huge part of my life, and it's how we show our love. So I'm really not surprised that was my dream job at the time. But later in life, probably I would have said lawyer or forensic psychologist.
Wow, I love that. And I also appreciate you sharing your why as well. I think that is so important. How do you think that your like personal journey and experiences have really led you to this point to help lead the people team at Clio?
Yeah, it's my story is really rooted in my family and in our generational history and ancestral history, and being the child of 2 immigrants, and being raised in a family that was very community oriented and very close and collectivist. Being part of a community and always putting community as a priority in your life was a huge value of mine, as well as work ethic and being really driven and wanting to really do the best job at whatever it was I was doing. Didn't mean I always had to do it perfectly, but I had to give it my best and give it my all. What led me to my current role is a bit of an unusual pathway for someone in HR or people. So I studied at Queen's University in Kingston, where there is actually the largest base of federal penitentiaries in Kingston, Ontario. So I started volunteering while I was at university in prisons there. And for me, there was a really sharp distinction, and I was in this really privileged educational institution. I was the first member of my family to ever go to university, and I really felt the need to be part of that whole community in Kingston, not just my, the prestigious university I was attending. So I started volunteering in prisons, and there's a large prison community in Kingston, and I saw firsthand how broken our justice system was. So at the time, I thought I'd go into law school. But I decided after that experience, I wanted to help prevent folks from entering the justice system in the first place. So after spending some time after I graduated working in nonprofits, I decided to pursue a master's in counseling psychology. And so I worked in counseling centers and small private practices where I mostly saw pro bono clients, and really developed a love for counseling and understanding humans and fostering really meaningful conversations and helping people really thrive. And then eventually I started thinking, how can I love helping others catalyze their potential. How could I do this in an organizational setting? And so I shifted out of clinical work into business and into the business field, and worked with a company called Kitnace, which I'm not sure if you've heard of, but it was founded by the same founders as Lululemon. And they are a very people development focused company. So that's kind of what Lululemon is known for. And their founder, Chip Wilson, was, he was known for saying we're a people development organization disguised as a retailer. And I love the way they thought about people in an organizational setting. And so I eventually went on to be their in-house coach and lead their people development function. And then I moved to another big company in Vancouver called Aritzia as their head of L&D. And after I left Aritzia, I knew I needed to work with an organization I felt really values aligned with. So when I learned about Clio and the type of culture that we have here and our mission, which is to transform the legal experience for all, it felt like weirdly right. It brought me back to my passion, which is around transforming experiences for those in the justice system. And it's just felt like the most perfect fit I could hope for.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, I think it's a great story to tell because you can tell a common thread of just people development and wanting to tell important stories and connect folks as well. And it's interesting when you have these kinds of conversations when anyone brings up psychology or counseling, it's so directly related to the people function and just connecting and having conversations, whether it be hard professional development, all these types of connections and meeting employees where they are actively listening. So I love that. One of the many kind of things that you mentioned at Clio that you help run and just help foster too is community and really employee engagement. And over the past year, we've a lot of companies really need to shift or re-strategize how they're thinking about building trust and also maintaining that with the team. How have you really done that over this past year?
Yeah, good question. So when I started, and funny story, my first day at Clio was the first day of work from home. So my first day on the job was March 16th, 2020. I always joke around, I was like the head of people at the time, and I was like the first head of people that never actually met a person. And so I've only known Clio in this virtual way. And we used to have a portfolio in the people department called Employee Experience, which housed our workplace experience team, which oversaw all of our offices and facilities. The employee experience team led our internal events and wellness programming. But what COVID really taught us was that we needed more resourcing towards true employee engagement. So it was less about just employee experience initiatives and more around how do we foster employee engagement across the entire employee life cycle. So we actually redesigned and restructured that portfolio recently to include what we're calling an employee engagement stream that will actively work towards KPIs that are intended to foster meaningful connections for our Clions. So we talk about this being meaningful connection to self, the work that you do, the outputs that you make, how enabled you feel in your role, how set up for success you are, connection to our customers and the industry and the mission that we serve more broadly around transforming the legal experience for all, and also connection to each other. So in whether you're at home or in an office, feeling deeply connected to your colleagues, feeling that you have a real sense of community here. And we do use some tools to help with this, but that's really our mandate is how do we foster those meaningful connections at every touch point, no matter where you're located as a Clion, which is what we call ourselves.
Yeah, I think that is so important to have that structure and get really specific in terms of what we mean by connection. I think oftentimes we forget about the first pillar that you mentioned in terms of connection to self. And if you feel enabled in your role too, what kind of tools do you use to achieve these goals in terms of really engagement amongst Clions?
So we use some tools that help us spark conversation, that help us remain connected. But some of these are, more platform-based and other just, what we've learned over time in terms of how we show up as leaders and what the spaces that we want to create. So we use one tool is called Thought Exchange. And this is a platform where employees can anonymously surface their thoughts, ideas, questions, and people can upvote them. So we can see what are the most salient themes or questions that people really care about right now. What are the ideas that really matter? And then what we can do is design, programs, experiences, or even just communications around whatever's showing up in the org. So it's a really nice way to foster safety in two-way conversation in a virtual setting. And then we use all the normal stuff. We have employee engagement surveys that we use twice a year. And we also have a third survey per year that's specifically focused on diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. So it's our inclusion survey. We oftentimes include things like AMAs or Ask Me Anythings as part of our departmental and company-wide meetings and town halls. We have anonymous hotlines as well for more serious topics. And one of our core values, it's not a tool, but something that really drives how we engage with folks, is we have this value of no doors, only windows, which means we really lean into transparent, authentic, real communication. So during COVID, we've really leaned on over communicating. At one point, our CEO went 100 days sending a daily email with just his the workings of his inner mind, his thoughts, observations, feelings. And it really, when we find that we lean into communication often, we get a lot of feedback, sentiment, and just a real pulse on how people are doing in a more authentic way. So that's one of the ways that we keep engagement high.
Yeah, I think effective and transparent communication, especially modeled at the top, whether it's a CEO, leaders, or your people manager, is really important. And when we're talking about effective communication, leadership, and the feedback tools that you mentioned, the spaces that you're creating, it relates to one of the topics that keeps coming up in people spaces, which is psychological safety at work. And it's something that we know it's important to really foster and cultivate. It doesn't just happen without intention, but sometimes it's hard to measure qualitatively. How do you think about measuring the success and maintaining of psychological safety at Clio?
Yeah, so I mean, I am super passionate about trust as being one of the foundational building blocks of doing good work and of just human connection in general. And we also know that despite our best efforts to be a workplace that I believe is doing an incredible job to foster a trustworthy and safe environment for all people, people join Clio and every organization with organizational trauma and baggage from being just through their experiences in life. And, some folks more than others have been systemically oppressed time and time again throughout their life. And so it's not easy for them to extend that trust naturally when they enter an organization, even if that organization is awesome and doing the best job that they can do. So we believe that it's really important for Clion's voices to be heard and to help shape how our company evolves and grows. And that as a senior leadership team, we're actually actioning on the feedback provided, because what people need when they're unable to naturally extend that trust right away is experience, seeing the leaders around them do something different and engage with them in a different way. So the most meaningful thing we can do is actually put action behind our words and walk the walk. So that eventually breeds trust over time. And that form of walking the walk and not just talking the talk, it's a process, not a destination. So it's difficult to measure. But one of the ways that we can get a sense on how well we're doing or how off the mark we're doing is honestly just participation rates. So whether it's an AMA, a thought exchange, we put out an engagement survey result. If we see high engagement, we know that people feel comfortable enough to share. That doesn't mean that people often don't give a watered down version of their perspectives while they're still feeling things out, but they've taken that first step at putting themselves out there. Another measure is the depth of topics that we get. Some leaders get really squirrely when they get asked the hard things.
Sure.
When people feel safe, they can ask the tough things. So if we're getting those hard questions, to me, that's a signal that we are creating enough safety and trust for people to be able to be vocal about what really matters. And we know that what we've done is create a place where we have a very limited fear of reprisal or fear of folks getting, treated negatively because of what they bring up. So to me, it's just separating that signal from noise in those areas.
Yeah, I appreciate that point too, in terms of the kind of amount of feedback and the types of feedback that you're getting as well. I know there's definitely a school of thought that if you have no feedback within an organization, whether it's positive or negative, then things are working perfectly. But we know that everybody has thoughts all the time, and you really want to build up that trust to really share the experiences that are happening as well. And speaking of putting kind of action behind words, some people think that, building trust in an organization is a nice to have, and they're working towards it as well. But I really want to talk about the impact of employee trust and listening. How do you really see that culture of listening really manifesting at the organization at large, past like a nice to have, like as part of the company?
Yeah, something I used to always say to clients back in my counseling days was vulnerability begets vulnerability, or perhaps better phrase, like openness begets openness. So I mentioned our value around no doors, only windows, which kind of speaks to this. So when we're open with our employees about how we're thinking through tough decisions, even if we haven't arrived at a solution yet, but we're able to articulate our thought process, what we're grappling with, it's incredibly trust building, and it humanizes the organization, and it gives people permission to also come to us when they don't have something perfectly baked out. So when we create space for that safety to have like half-baked thoughts, to engage in learning, to listen, to share things when they're not perfect, that connective tissue really forms and trust follows. So the other thing I feel really strongly about in terms of how we see this show up in culture is being able to create spaces for employee voice and to actually listen in those spaces. So I think one of the ways we see it the best is actually not through something we do as leaders, but it's in what we see our employees do and what they're able to surface and initiate. So one of the things we developed during the pandemic is specifically in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, was we realized we could be doing a better job at just listening to our people. And like I said, this is a process, not a destination. I thought we were pretty good at it, but there's always room to be better. So we started creating these sessions called Clio Listens, which was a bit of a twist on our traditional like lunch and learns. And these are just spaces for Cleons to have a specific Cleons who have a specific vantage point or lived experience to really share and create space to have others listen to what that experience has been like and what we can learn from that and how we can challenge our implicit biases. It's not intended to be an active discussion in some of the ways that lunch and learns are, but it's a space that's held for folks who want to put up their hands to say, I have something that I think could be really meaningful here, and I want the company to hear it, and I want my Cleons to hear it. And, I think when you can really listen, not for that part where you can jump in, but true active listening, it's one of the most important qualities that we as humans can possess. And, if we can create a space that allows people to practice that, I think we're creating a generation of leaders that will be, incredible. And at the end of the day, all people just want is to feel heard.
I definitely agree with you. And I love that part about not waiting for the point where you can jump in on a conversation or thinking about what you're going to say next. I think intentionally creating that space and having a goal behind why you're doing either an event or a listening session is really important, and what the ideal result would be, and holding that space for that individual, and hopefully others kind of glean something from that shared experience as well. And something that we discussed in terms of what we wanted to talk about today too was deliberately like creating this developmental organization. Can you walk me through what that means at Clio?
Yeah, absolutely. So deliberate development, or being a deliberately developmental organization, is a concept taken from a book called An Everyone Culture. And it's something that really resonated with us. And my colleague, Lindsay Dyer, sort of instituted this terminology at Clio and really helped us design deliberate development in its inception at Clio. So deliberate development is one way we achieve what we call a human and high performing culture. And those are the things that we aim for at Clio and for our Cleons. We want to create a space for people to be humans, and we want to help unlock them to be high performing and do the best work of their careers. So we believe in investing in our employees' development at every stage of the employee life cycle and tenure, across multiple areas. So areas of their craft, their particular skill set, their character, their personal development, their leadership development, the stuff that's going to make them a better human and develop their self-awareness, and company specific knowledge. So what's going to make them successful here at Clio based on what they need to know about how we do things, slightly differently. And we believe in providing all of the fundamental opportunities for a Cleon to do the best work of their career so that they can then be in the driver's seat of their own career development. So if they want to go from being, you know, a junior IC to being on a people manager track in a year, they can clearly drive that process. And there are the right injections of learning, both classroom learning, facilitated learning, and on the job experiences to help them get there. So we progress and compensate people in accordance to deliberate development as well. So our whole compensation philosophy is actually tied to development rather than quote unquote performance. And the reason why is that we believe in incentivizing intrinsic motivation over extrinsic motivation, that ultimately that leads to the best, you know, results or ultimately performance. But it starts with how connected you feel to your own development and how hungry you are to develop and want to capitalize on those opportunities.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are a bunch of Cleons that are hungry to contribute to the organization, but also, as you said, kind of progress in their careers and level up their skills as well. And a lot of the strategies that we're talking about are deliberate, intentional, and have meaning behind it. And some say that it's really hard to be intentional and proactive when we're growing and scaling at such a large rate. And I know that Clio had some exciting news where you received Series E funding, and I imagine the team will continue to grow at a rapid pace and be high growth. How do you really think about scaling company culture from that regard as well? Again, with what you mentioned, a lot of people bringing in their different experiences working at different companies that might have kind of different values too.
Yeah, I think the challenge that many companies struggle with when they start to scale or hit a certain stage of growth is how to retain what makes them special and sort of like their special sauce without diluting it, but also without becoming so attached to their previous ways of doing things that they become myopic or they become fragile or they lose an ability to be agile and move with the times. So we have this framework that we speak about often here at Clio, where we talk about this sense of VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity being present during most times of change or chaos or whatever. So, I mean, the last year in the pandemic was an exemplary of being in a state of VUCA. And we really believe that, when we're in a time of scaling and growth, some VUCA kind of mindset is inevitable because there's a lot of uncertainty. There's stuff that we've never done before as a company. There's stuff that our founder has never done before. This is new for everyone, not just the folks that are more junior in the organization. But we really believe that our job as individuals and specifically as leaders is to bring what we call like a VUCA Prime mindset. So turning volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity into vision, understanding, clarity, and agility. So whenever we can encounter a problem that comes with scale, like decision-making, particularly around culture, we think about how to tap into that VUCA Prime mindset in order to rally our teams around whatever decisions we're making and really foster that sense of cohesion and connection even as we grow.
Yeah, I mean, again, a very organized and intentional way of thinking about things, and especially ambiguity, and turning it into something like agility and being dynamic in your strategy. Having a two-way conversation with folks at an organization across all levels is really important. And one of the ways I'm sure that kind of the VUCA Prime mindset was over this past year in terms of working from home, and now you have something in place for distributed by design. Can you tell us what that means? I know we were talking about this before this call too, of how you kind of got to that point, and what that strategy is for the workplace.
Yeah, so distributed by design is what we're calling sort of our new state of our workforce. And what COVID taught us is that our workplace and our people are incredibly agile, and they are highly trustworthy, and they've not just survived, but they've really thrived during a time of global chaos. This doesn't mean they haven't had a lot of personal and professional hurdles to jump. But this led us quite early on to really consider our approach to workplace centricity. And we made the call quite early on to move to a virtual first workforce, but one that would retain our offices, or our hubs as we call them, to maximize choice for our employees. So that's what we're calling distributed by design. We will lean on virtual first mediums and formats for connecting, but we will still retain physical office locations for Cleons that are, working in suboptimal conditions, or that really need, the mental health break of being around other people, or they just feed off the energy of others to do their work. And we've built this by really assuming a first principles approach. So we asked ourselves, what do we really believe philosophically that needs to be true in order for this new approach to be successful and work? And what we ended up on were sort of these 5 principles. We knew we would need to evaluate our approach to geographic location and hireability internationally. We knew we'd want to design a world-class and equitable work environment to deliberately foster meaningful connection to self, others, and the company. We knew that we would need an operational guide in the form of a playbook. So, how do we do things around here? What does this mean? How do we make sense of the world of work? We knew we'd need to differentiate our employment brand from other companies, and to think about how to communicate that broadly. And we knew that we wanted to create workplaces, so both our hubs and our at-home workplace experiences that would enable a sense of community regardless of where someone was tapping into. So what we did was we organized these 5 beliefs into work streams, and we assigned directly responsible individuals to sort of prototype out the thinking and actions that we would need to build out a workplace designed around each of those principles. So it helped us really streamline the decisions and roadblocks that we would need to encounter in each of those work streams, and allowed us to design really intentionally, deliberately against each of those, and then to evaluate overall, does this feel like a workplace that we want to create? Does this feel like we're still able to be us and to retain our culture in this workplace? And thankfully it has. So we realized quite early on that that approach was unique, and it led us to a quality of strategic direction that I think other companies at the time are really struggling to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, talking about prototyping and testing out new strategies, and of course, making the decision early on, it sounds a lot like a product or a service for a company as well, and really operationalizing it to see the success. And a lot of people talk about employees being similar to customers, where you want the experience to be just as great as a customer experience for the employer brand as well. And it sounds like Clio is really at the forefront of doing that for their employees. And I think maximizing options is really important. I know you mentioned kind of in our conversation the response to a lot of companies really supporting Black Lives Matter and creating that space, but also wanted to pass the mic to you to talk a little bit about other either diversity, equity, and initiatives happening at Clio, or just what the thought process is behind just an overarching strategy as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could chat about our DIBE, is what we call DEI at Clio, so diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. I could chat about it for hours, but I'll try to simplify. Because of who we are inherently as a company, and because of our mission, which is to transform the legal experience for all, and the populations and the industry that we serve, social justice, equality, diversity, inclusion are really baked into Clio's DNA. And we have always been really committed and active in this space. So for us, there wasn't a huge 180 pivot when we, kind of went through this moment of, I think, social justice reckoning and awakening as a broader culture in the world in the last year. But what it did allow us to do was really underscore that this work is never over, despite how involved and active you are. It's a process. It's not a destination. It should always be evolving. It should always be, both proactive and responsive to what we're seeing. And we have an opportunity to be a leader in this space. So we did decide to take a much more active anti-racism stance as a company. We developed a commitment that we said we are striving to be an anti-racist organization. We chose the word strive intentionally to illuminate the fact that we don't believe this work is ever done. It's not a box to be checked. This is something we should always be continually doing. And we really wanted to create new spaces for employees to grow, learn, and challenge their own biases in that area. Just given the amount of new information for many folks that surfaced over that. And then for some folks, how not new that information was, and how much struggle they had experienced with some of that, those experiences, and being on the receiving end of some of the oppression that we've heard about in the news for their whole lives. So we reinforced our accountability to DIBE work. Some of the initiatives that we launched were things like formally establishing employee resource groups, active discussion groups, things like our Clio listens sessions. We partnered with BIPOC organizations to help us transform our hiring practices and ensure that the candidate pools that we are generating for open roles have the most diverse folks in our pipeline that we can imagine. We encouraged all of our Clions to expense books on anti-racism and social justice more broadly to continue their own learning journeys. We instituted implicit bias training. We signed a pledge for pay parity to conduct pay inequity analysis and correct any pay gaps that may exist. So it was really this, and then all of the other things like, donations, training sessions, guest speakers. But for us, it was really about ensuring that we didn't just do the stuff that the public could see. It was really shining that mirror inwards and saying, how have our internal practices, or how could our internal practices contribute to a sense of systemic oppression or systemic racism? And how do we make sure that we are taking a critical lens on our internal practices to make sure that we're never resting on our laurels and improving in this space constantly?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there are a lot of initiatives that are happening, and there was conversations around if companies should be sharing this information publicly or just focusing on the internal work. And the reality is you can do what you said in terms of, you can do both. You can have that internal reflection and have trainings and help employees and do listening sessions, but you can also make kind of statements and use really intentional language in terms of what you said, like striving to be an anti-racist organization. I think that requires a lot of humility and just acknowledging that it's a continual journey and process. But of course, we want to mark just like progress and celebrate the progress of strategies too. Are there any in terms of KPIs that you look to say, okay, we have these programs in place, or, in terms of numbers or anything like that, where you're looking to see we're good, but we are going to continue to grow in this area?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one, and I'll tell you how we're approaching it. So we develop annual OKRs, which are objectives and key results for our company, but we also develop specific diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity OKRs every year to hold ourselves accountable to progress in this space. It's really difficult to quantify progress in this space in Canada, much different actually than in the US, because of what we are actually legally allowed to ask our employees in terms of collecting demographics information. So if we can't actually clearly collect data that tells us what our baseline is, it's really hard to measure what progress is. And there are also limitations to things that we can ask people in an interview process to hold ourselves accountable to understanding where we need to make more improvements by, hiring more folks from a different intersectionality, for example. Those limitations are there for a reason. Sometimes that information and providing it can be harmful. However, it does create a problem for us in terms of tracking. So one of the things we really wanted to focus on this year was representation in leadership roles specifically. We know that people need to see themselves represented in leadership in order to feel like they've got runway at a company. And we thought, we have an opportunity to do this a bit better. But rather than focusing on fill rates, we knew that would be really difficult to actually measure based on what we would just know from a candidate and talking to them based on what we could see and observe. And we know that a lot of people's identities are not necessarily things that you can see and observe. So what we decided to do is take more of a downstream focus on our KPIs. And what I mean by that is we're critically evaluating the problems we have in this space. And instead of focusing on downstream metrics, we're focusing more on upstream ones. And we're looking at things like, what are the systemic barriers that prevent people from getting into leadership roles? How can we make an effort to provide more training, more partnerships with academic institutions? How can we do more internal mobility to actually promote and train and provide opportunity to the folks we already have in-house? How can we partner with organizations to engage in more hiring brand campaigns to talk about what we're doing internally? So we are putting out the message that we're a place where anyone from any background can come and grow and develop and thrive, so that they know about us. So how can we build our networks and expand the pools of people that we want to attract from all sorts of different intersections and backgrounds, rather than actually just focusing on hitting a specific number and a fill rate? So if we can cast a really broad net, we feel like we've done 90% of the work. So we also have things that we are able to measure. So baseline sentiment in all 3 of our employee surveys that we release every year. And so over time, we're able to measure sentiment and understand how we're doing. But that's how we've approached it this year in terms of KPIs and metrics.
Yeah, I appreciate your point about internal mobility as well, and building out pipeline for leaders, and just looking at how you can help people in their career development too, in terms of if they want to be people managers or if they want to go a more director route, since everyone has different goals. I do want to ask about your experience just in the field more generally too, so this doesn't have to be in Clio specific, but what are you seeing in the people space that companies or individuals really need to hone in on or include in their strategy to be successful in the future of work, as we continue to build a new workplace?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've observed as sort of being a trend in this space is performative action. So companies posting black squares on Blackout Tuesday, posting a statement on all of their social, but not actually doing the internal analysis and improving on their internal practices that may be really limiting to folks in this space. So one of the things that I would really encourage folks to build into their strategies, it might not seem like big flashy kind of goals, like making a massive donation or something like that, but it might actually have a lot more meaningful impact on the people within the company. So things like conducting an analysis on whether you have any pay gaps across different intersections, deeply understanding that analysis and what pay gaps exist and why, and then developing like a multifaceted strategy to correct that, to provide the right sorts of implicit bias training, manager training, cultural sensitivity and cultural awareness training, even some light critical race theory training for employees that helps people that are in positions of power understand the role that they play in ensuring that they're creating a more diverse and equitable workplace, as well as supporting it through the policies and practices that your company upholds. So those are the pieces that I think can often be seen as like a subtle shift, but can, I think, have a tremendous impact and really signal that you're a company that's committed to this work.
Absolutely. And in terms of performative kind of actions as well, when your employees see that you're posting a black square or you're making a statement, but there's no kind of action behind it too, a theme that we've been talking about as well, you can tell it's genuine or if it's ingenuine. So I think it's super important to have that strategy in place as well, whether you do one or many of those kind of different examples that you provided too. I know we talked about kind of a range of different topics and you shared best practices for our listeners, but is there anything that I either didn't ask that you want to make sure to share before we close out our conversation, or 1 to 2 key takeaways that you hope people bring with them?
You asked such wonderful, thought-provoking questions. Maybe the only thing I could offer is, I think there's a lot that we chatted about that really lights people up, especially people in the people world. And my advice to really anyone who might be seeking a new career opportunity or who's evaluating which companies to join is to seek out mission and values aligned work. When you can align yourself to something that you feel is connected to your greater purpose, really we're limitless in what we're able to achieve. And I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you're passionate about, just tap into that passion, tap into that purpose, and what brings you the most sense of joy and contribution. And that is what I feel sort of pays off in dividends for folks in this space.
Yeah, and it also helps you from preventing burnout, and and not every day is going to be the best day, but on the less great days, you're just like, I'm doing this for the mission. And it goes back to purpose-driven work. So I definitely agree with you there. And I think that's a great message to end our conversation with. Natalie, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And as a reminder for our listeners, All Voices believes in the empowerment of everyone to speak up, and we know that it's a requirement for the organization to succeed. We'll speak soon.